Our session is an overview of corporate financing. We cover patterns of corporate financing in terms of equity and debt, financial markets, and financial institutions. Corporate financing comes from both internal and external sources. Internal sources consist of profits from operations net of dividends. Retained earnings are measured as profits minus dividends paid. And retained earnings are the principal internal source of corporate financing. External sources of corporate financing consist of equity, which comes from the sale of stock to owners, typically the public. Equity amounts to owner's money, and debt, which comes from the sale of bonds to bondholders. Debt is considered other people's money. Over the past 15 years or so, most corporate financing has been from internal sources, that is, from retained earnings. There's also been a fair amount of new debt, especially in the late 90s, when the stock market was so positive. But look at new equity. In most years, there's actually been negative new equity, which means that corporate repurchases of their own stock have exceeded new corporate stock sales. We'll discuss corporate stock purchases and sales in subsequent sessions. Here is one example of corporate financing is the right side of the balance sheet for Merck for 2003 and 2004. Note that in 2004, Merck had $42 billion in assets. So how did it finance these assets? Its total debt was about $25 billion, consisting of current liabilities, where current liabilities are loans that have to be paid off within about a year, and about $4.5 billion in long-term debt, plus some other liabilities. The total here is about $25 billion in debt. The equity on Merck's balance sheet was about $17 billion. You can see that number down here. Most of the equity consists of retained earnings, or earnings of the firm after dividends paid. Merck also has over 2 billion shares of stock outstanding. We'll discuss the valuation of common stock in a later session. Corporations go to financial markets to get external financing, both debt and equity. When corporations issue securities to owners, that is stock shareholders, or lenders, bond owners or bondholders, they do so in primary markets. When stock owners or bondholders trade, they do so in secondary, not primary markets, such as the New York Stock Exchange and the New York bond market. Secondary markets are formally established markets where buyers and sellers of existing, that is, previously issued, securities are traded. Securities can also be traded in over-the-counter markets, which are informal markets sometimes supported by brokerage houses. In practice, companies issue obligations such as stock certificates and bonds to financial intermediaries such as banks, insurance companies, and brokerage firms. These intermediaries provide funds back to the company to support the company's assets and operations. These intermediaries in turn issue their own obligations, such as bank accounts, insurance policies, and mutual fund shares, to their investors, who might be depositors, insurance policy holders, or mutual fund investors. These investors provide the funds to the intermediaries, which ultimately go to financing the corporations in which the intermediaries invest.